was just a funny scene out there. It starts pouring, and she just chill on the floor and vision away.
Texting on the crop circle.
All right, are we live or?
We're live.
We are live. Well, that's time, so that makes sense. All right, well, thank you all for joining. I will go a little bit off script today because this was originally set up for last time I did this class, which was leading up to Lent. So it's all things that I think are important to talk about, except we're going into a different fast, which is the Nativity fast. So a lot of this is very similar, so we'll cover all of the things. It will be good. So as this is the class focused more on the practical side, I plan on talking about some of the liturgical changes that happen in all of the fasts, including Lent. Those of you that were paying attention right before the service when I was noting some of the liturgical indications as to what to do if the fast starts on different days of the week and how to handle that, there are changes that the church goes through when we enter a fasting period. But before we get there, let's start by just recalling what the purpose of any fasting period is, which would include, of course, Great Lent. Great Lent is just more of what we do the other times, right? So as much as all fasting periods are a moment of introspection and preparation for whatever feast is coming up, Lent is just that much more so for Pascha, of course. Ideally, fasting should be setting aside passions and increasing our positive spiritual practices, fasting, prayer, and almsgiving. We've talked about this a little bit in various forms, especially when we talked about that we had the week where we went over some of the very basics of fasting, and I had some recommendations for cookbooks, but that was in the last class, so it's been a little while. So just to recap, of course, when we fast, the ideal anyway that we aim for eventually is to cut out the vast majority of animal products. The mostly true rule, as far as I'm aware, is to say anything with the backbone or the product thereof. So you can eat all the insects of the sea or of the land that you like, but any kind of meat, as we usually would think of it, would be off the table, literally and figuratively. But that is not the end of what we do during the fasting period, which is part of why I always tell people coming into fasts to usually do a reduced form of the fast in some form or fashion, because it is only one element of what we do during fasting times. Because we are ideally simplifying and reducing the amount of food that we are eating, that should be saving us some time and money that we can then put towards other things, specifically the various ministries of the church. Many of the fathers talk about how by reducing our food, we have more money to give to others in need. So that is a very tangible part of the fast, or at least it should be for many. And then, of course, ideally, simplifying things means we should have more time for prayer as well. And hopefully attending services. Of course, in Lent, we have many additional services. During the other fasts, it isn't as common for parishes to add services, like the pre-sanctified services are unique to Lent. There isn't really anything similar in the other fasts, although there are a few sort of pre-festive services as we get to the very, very end of the fast, leading up into Nativity, that follow kind of the form that we see in Holy Friday with a vesperal liturgy on the morning of the eve, but generally speaking, we don't have additional services outside of what you would otherwise be doing. So if you look at our calendar coming up, you'll see pretty much normal. And of course, by simplifying, by increasing our almsgiving, by increasing our prayer, by trying to cut out our passions as best we can, this should allow us to enter into the joy of whatever the feast, although again, most especially Lent into Pascha, much more joyfully, right? It makes the feast feel that much more of a feast if you've truly fasted, right? So it is to our benefit to do both feasting and fasting in their appropriate times. Liturgically, there are a number of things that change in any fast, but especially in Lent. Obviously, we will change colors. So Lent is probably the most obvious because I don't know how this happened, but pretty much every Christian denomination, to my knowledge, uses purple to mean Lent. That is not true, I believe, for any other liturgical color, but purple seems to be Lent everywhere. The colors for the Nativity fast are all over the place. Some places will do red during the fast, and then, during fasting periods, you will either see red or gold. During the feast, you will either see red, gold, or white, depending on what they've done previously. I couldn't really tell you exactly why. A lot of the rubrics for the liturgical colors are way later and very regional. So someone thought it looked good to wear red. I believe in this parish what we've done in the past is red for the fast and white for the feast, which, if I'm remembering right, is our diocesan practice as well. But even saying that means very little because every parish is going to have their slight variations to these things, and they may very well do a different set of colors. So, but regardless, almost always the color will change. And in Lent, we go even further. So we do purple during the weekends in Lent, but during the weekdays, at least in the very fancy Slavic style, we go to black during the Monday through Friday services, which would include the pre-sanctified services. And then we go back to purple for the weekends and back into black the next Monday. These, if you ever have the chance to go, another service you might see in Lent sometimes, although around here I've gotten the impression they're not super common, but in some places they're very popular, is to do Pan-Orthodox Vespers services on Sunday evenings. That would be a time when you could see the liturgical color shifting from purple to black. If you come for the Forgiveness Vespers service at the beginning of Lent, you'll see that change as well. And then, of course, we have the services leading up to the feasts that we swap back to the swap to the festal colors. So Lent, you see a lot of changing colors. In other fasts, especially the Nativity fast, not really as much. The Apostles' fast is the other major fasting period. The colors there are also kind of all over the place. And some liturgical notes say that the feast itself should be orange. Orange is not a color you've probably ever seen. I've only ever seen it hanging in a closet. But I think most places will do red for the feast itself. The color for the fast varies wildly. Some places just stay in green for I don't know what reason. Some places, I think, switch back to gold. I'm not sure if anyone goes to red for the whole fast, but different colors. We don't really do this as much during the other fasts, but in Lent, certainly, we switch to Lenten melodies. You'll hear during the weekday services, again, especially the pre-sanctified services, which you should all be going to, hopefully, when we get there. And you'll hear that it just sounds different. It's different melodies that we don't do for the rest of the year. This, again, doesn't really happen with the other fasts. We also switch to the liturgies of St. Basil during the weekends, which we also don't do during the other fasting period. So you see, there's a lot of these changes that are very specific to Lent. However, the weekday services, there are a number of changes that are held within all of the fasts. We no longer do the Prokimena at Vespers and instead do Alleluia. And instead of God is the Lord at Matins, we do Alleluia. So you'll sometimes see it noted Matins with Alleluia. Which is to indicate that it's a fasting service. Again, always in Lenten weekday services, I don't know if it's, people don't tend to do as many weekday services through the rest of the year, so I don't know how often you would really run into that. We do here because I live 20 steps away. So it's easy enough for me to come over and do some of these services. So you will see if you come to the Vesper services here that we will switch to that fasting form for those evening Vespers. And if you come for the morning matins, you'll see that as well. It isn't quite all the way to Lent. So in Lent, like the hours also shift and have Old Testament readings in them, which we don't do for the other fasting periods. In fact, there's a lot of Old Testament readings in the Lenten services. We also throw the prayer of St. Ephrem into multiple slots in every service. In the other fasts, it's only done at the end of the Vespers and I think also the Matin service. And just the ones we don't do the whole giant form like we do in Lent. So we do very much have kind of a half step up during most of the fasts and a very large step up in Lent for the number of prostrations that we're doing during the services. Although I will remind those of you that do come to the Matins, you remember we do at least one prostration normally for the Theotokos at the end of the canon. I've given you the text of the prayer of St. Ephrem, which again during Lent we use all the time. And I believe the St. Tikhon's prayer book actually instructs you to use this during all fasts. If you use some of the other ones like the Jordanville one from Rocor, I don't believe they have any note in there, and I'm not as familiar with the other ones from Ancient Faith or New Rome Press or anything like that, but the St. Tikhon's one I know does at least have this in for all fasting periods. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but just to note that the full form is to do each little verse with a prostration, and then to do 12 reverences, just saying, "Oh God, cleanse me a sinner," as you do each, and then going all the way down to the ground, and then doing the whole thing through one more time with only one prostration at the end. Does that make sense? Yeah. It isn't certainly wrong to do that any time, but we do it all the time with only a few modifications in Lent. The other thing that we do during Lent, and to a lesser extent the other fasts, is put in way more psalms. In Lent, you will see that there are kathismas called for all over the place, where we would normally not do them. We already tend to skip them, so they often end up just also getting skipped. But if you're paying attention in the books or something, because a number of you are in the choir, you may notice that there are times where it says to do kathisma and you just don't. And then also reading the Gospels is increased. So this is, I'll remind you very briefly that the liturgical pattern we use is tied very much, it is the monastic rite. We've lost the cathedral rite from Constantinople a long time ago, so we only have the typicon from the Studite monastery, which is monastic. So if we were following the full set of services as we have them put out, I believe you would get through the Psalter once a week during most of Lent, and you would get through the entire set of Gospels. I believe it starts like the second to last week. You start adding Gospel readings all over the place to get through the full set of Gospels. But again, other than a very minor uptick in Psalms for the other fasts, we do not go through quite that rigorous set of increases. We've already talked about the Forgiveness Vespers a little bit, Clean Monday. Both Lent and the Nativity Fast are 40 days. How long is the Apostles' Fast?
It varies on what day Pascha depends on.
Yes. So it can be anywhere from non-existent, and we just go right into the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, or it can be a month, which is about what it's supposed to be. Yes, because of the oddity of using the new calendar for everything that is associated with a date, so December 25th, March 25th, whatever, versus the old calendar for everything associated with Pascha and Paschal Tide and therefore Pentecost and everything else, we have an odd little mismatch where the variable fast goes from not super long, a month to not super long to non-existent. So, all right, there's that. Any questions then about any of that? I know that's probably more than you'll remember, but that's okay. At least you've been introduced to it. Yeah. Sure.
I didn't understand what you meant by the 12 references during the...
If you remember back to Lent, the priest will come out and stand in the front and will say, "The Lord and Master of my life, do a prostration, but grant rather spirit of chastity, prostration, yea, Lord and King, do a prostration," and then standing there, he will simply cross and bow, touching the floor, and saying, "Oh God, cleanse me a sinner," 12 times, before then going back to the top and doing the whole thing once through with only one prostration at the end. Got it? Great.
I remember last year you had like the rest of
Yes, the particular practice here for when to do prostrations seemed to have been a little arbitrary. So, I don't know. All right. So the other unique element of Lent is that we have themes every week. This does not really happen with the other fasts. We just kind of go through the normal services for the Manaean in terms of whatever saints are being commemorated that day. So you heard tonight, even though this was the first service of the fast, that we were singing about the martyrs, Didas, Guria, and I can't remember the last one's name. Abibus. Yeah, anyway, those guys. The three martyrs, whose number is equal to the Trinity, as we said, I believe. In Lent in particular, though, each week has a theme. So here are the themes. The first week is the triumph of Orthodoxy, which remembers the Sunday in 843 when they, after having completed the council and said that actually icons are a good thing, they were joyously processed back into churches. And so on that day, we bring icons to the church, and at the end, we do a procession where everyone carries their icons. It's also the day when you get to hear what it sounds like when a bunch of kids drop pieces of wood on the floor. A very brief story, when I was in seminary serving, there was the abbot had forgotten that people bring icons, and so he turned in the middle of the service and was like, what are the kids doing? And someone was like, it's the Sunday of Orthodoxy, they've all got icons. And he was like, oh, so they didn't just bring pieces of lumber into the church. Like, no. We'll talk more about this later, but the very basic reason why icons, well, actually we've already talked about it, but just to remind you, the very basic reason that icons are important is because you can cheat and read if you want, or you can remember.
Because the Lord came in the flesh.
Yeah, it's not entirely wrong. Yeah.
I was just kind of reading a little bit of it.
Because matter matters. Because the world that we are in can convey grace. That's why we have relics and icons and all these things, right? And we know that because Jesus, took on our flesh, right? So, and took that flesh when he ascended up into heaven. So this is in contrast to certain historical groups that felt like this world was only evil and bad, and that the whole purpose of our life is to find different ways to put off our flesh, subject it, basically kill it, so that we can be our true spiritual beings. Maybe that was taken up by some. I don't think it was, as I recall anyway, it wasn't strictly Gnostic. Remember that Gnostic is a really, really big umbrella, kind of like saying Protestant today. So possibly there were groups that said that, but I don't think it was necessarily a hallmark of Gnosticism in general. The next weekend is not weekend, although it starts with Sunday, but it goes through the week. St. Gregory Palamas. He was very important in what is sometimes called the second triumph of Orthodoxy, teaching that our salvation comes through our bodies, and specifically through the ascetical practices and prayer. In effect, this is a very similar theme to the first week, saying that we can become God because God became man, right? Not literally, actually God, like some groups believe. We don't think that we're going to get a planet, but deification, right? The process of putting on Christ, as we sing in our services. Next week is the cross. This is the midpoint of the fast, and the hymns certainly remind you of that. It is a slightly more happy service, we'll say. We're reminded of the empty cross and of the coming resurrection. So the hymns are very quick to remind us that we've done good so far, and we just have to keep going a little bit so that we can get to the triumph of the resurrection to come. It's also one of the only times in Lent we'll wear another color, which is red for the cross. The other one that we'll do is for Annunciation. But the next week is St. John Climacus, the author of the Ladder of Divine Scent. He talks a lot about ascetical practices and gives I put here, a precise though very dense 30-step process to reaching salvation. I don't generally recommend reading that off the bat. Someday, certainly, but it's a lot to get through, and it's written for monks. So, although he does have a little blurb at the beginning that is more generally applicable, but again, it's a lot. So, I wouldn't start there. If you are in a monastery and one that is particularly enthusiastic, you might find the ladder is actually called to be read through most of the Lenten services. The canon at Matins is paused for various readings. We don't usually do that. In modern times, it ends up making the services take forever. So I suppose if you're cutting out your complex meals, then maybe you've got extra time to be in services, but it's a lot. The last Sunday of Lent proper is St. Mary of Egypt. We celebrated a little bit earlier. Remember, we'll have that feast during one of the midday services in Lent, or midweek services in Lent, where we read her whole life. But she has her own Sunday as well, which she's a great model of repentance and ascetical practices as well. And she is there to strengthen us for that last final little push into Pascha. Palm Sunday is not technically part of Lent. We've talked about this before. By our reckoning, we have the 40 days of Lent, and then we have Lazarus Saturday and Palm Sunday, and then we get into Holy Week, and then we have Pascha. So that period of time is not considered to be part of Lent. However, it is part of the process of getting to Pascha, regardless. Hopefully you're aware, commemorating Christ's triumphant entrance into Jerusalem, the children lay down the palms of victory in their garments as they cry out all of the Hosanna, and we talked about this last week in our second catechumen class. And it is very closely tied to the feast of Lazarus the day before, the raising of Lazarus the day before, because part of the reason that there were such large crowds for him in Jerusalem was because word of the raising of Lazarus after 4 days had spread. And so people were coming out to see the person that had worked the great miracle. It's interesting to me that Lazarus is basically not commemorated at all outside of the Orthodox Church. I think a little bit in the Catholic world, and if he's remembered at all, it's grouped in with Mary and Martha in the rest of the Christian world. But for us, it's a very big deal. It's part of the beginning of the celebration of Palm Sunday. And then, of course, we get to Pascha, the Feast of Feasts. We've talked about this before in our 101 when we went through all the great feasts. But, of course, just a reminder, we have the full week of Bright Week after, where we celebrate Lent every day. This is the only feast we do that for. None of the other feasts have the same amount of... it is very normal to have a forefeast and an afterfeast. But the difference with Pascha is that we celebrate Pascha itself for the entirety of Bright Week. In some ways, it's considered like a single day, which we do not do for any of the other feasts. Only Pascha, the Feast of Feasts, gets that. We do still have an afterfeast, though, of course. Paschal Tide goes until pretty much up to Pentecost. For Nativity, how long is the afterfeast? give you a hint, you sing songs about it. And then what do we go into right after that? What's the next feast? That's Theophany. Yeah, circumcision is good remembering that. It's a feast of the Lord, but it's not celebrated like one fully. So we don't pause the nativity to celebrate it. As I said in the other class, originally, entry into the temple, theophany, circumcision, and nativity were all one feast. And then as certain heresies arose and they felt the need to focus on different elements of Christ, they split them apart, and circumcision just kind of got left behind a little bit. So we still do celebrate it January 1st, but it isn't given quite the same pomp and circumstance as the other ones. Yes?
So, for the 50 days of, it says 50-day continuation of the feast. I'm kind of confused as to why we don't do like the Antiochians, who they don't have any Wednesday, Friday fast, but we do. I don't understand why we...
So to give some context, the Antiochian and I think Greek world are the Byzantine world does not call for any fasting at all during the entirety of the Paschal celebration, which includes Bright Week and all of Paschaltide until we get to Pentecost, which I believe also has a fast-free week, even for us, and then it goes back to normal. My sneaking suspicion for that is that it's one, I mentioned before that we have the monastic typicon, the way we put our services together and how many services and all that stuff is what you'd see in a monastery. That also means our rubrical notes for when and how to fast come from the monastic practice. So I think that's part of it. You also see that during that time, most, maybe not quite all, but quite a few of those fasting days are marked as fish, wine, and oil. If you know anything about the way monastics often work, their normal default is to basically be fasting the way we do, and just with fish, wine, and oil. So by saying fish, wine, and oil, it's almost saying it's just normal, like any other day.
I wanted to ask that on the calendar that we have, where
Yeah.
on a fast day, like a Friday or whatever, it'll say wine and oil. That means
Mhm.
you have wine and oil
Mhm.
that day? Okay.
It is a fast, yeah, because normally we would not do fish, wine, or oil on fasting days. So if it says anything there, then that is allowed on that day. Yuck. Does that answer the question then? Yeah. I have heard it said by some people in authority off the record, so I won't say names or when or who or how, but that there are many in favor of changing it. It's just what we've done in the Slavic world, and anytime you make any change like that, you're going to have some people that throw a big stink. So, but it is clearly within the realm of valid Orthodox practice. There are pretty old stories or records of people describing the celebration of Pascha, and they'll reference that it is fast-free that whole time. So, yeah.
I remember I didn't realize I was using an Antiochian calendar and that it was different, so I was just, like halfway through Pascha, and I'm driving with someone else who's from my church, and he's like, yeah, like, what'd you have for breakfast? I'm like, oh, like eggs and stuff. He's like, you have eggs? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, oh, like, today's Friday. And I was like, yeah. We're not fasting. And my calendar says we're not fasting until after Pentecost. And he's like, no, that's the Antiochians. And I'm like,
Yeah.
what?
Yes. So we are in the OCA. The OCA on paper follows the Slavic practice, which would be all of that stuff. In practice, we do all sorts of different things. The OCA is kind of a melting pot, just like the rest of the U.S. And so I've mentioned before that we have liturgical things we do here that you would never find in a Russian church. Things like the great entrance coming all the way out. Or on Pascha, we do the whole like banging on the door and reading the gospel lesson from outside. The Russian practice is not to do any of that. The Russian practice does the great entrance just out the door and immediately into the doors. On Pascha, they do their procession, they do Blessed is the Kingdom, and just go right inside. They don't do any of the fun stuff that we do.
So the OCA came up with that?
No, those are all Byzantine things.
Oh,
Yeah, so Greeks, Arabic, Antiochian, they will all do those things, yeah. This particular parish, as I think you all know, but although it's not uncommon for a lot of OC parishes, has people from all over. And so we'll do or not do something, and almost without fail, someone will come forward and be, Father, we didn't do this thing. Like, well, that's not actually our practice in the OCA, technically, but if enough people here feel so that it's an important thing, then we can certainly talk about doing that. So anyway, all that to say, do what your priest says for fasting during the Paschal Tide. Yes, the calendars that we publish will follow the Russian practice and say not to, but I certainly would not hold it against a parishioner if they tried to come and confess and say that they were following the Antiochian calendar. It's a very valid practice, historical practice as well. Yeah. All right. I think we've covered most of the rest of the things that are in here. There's a little bit about Pascha itself. Obviously, we changed back to bright colors, and then we have themes for the following weeks: Thomas Sunday, the myrrh-bearing women, the paralytic, the Samaritan woman, the blind man, and the Sunday, the Holy Fathers, and then, of course, we get to Pentecost. So we have similar. We've got themes for the fast. We've got themes for the feast. Of course, we don't keep doing the somber Lenten melodies during Paschal Tide, so we switch back to that. And during liturgy itself, during Pascha, so during Bright Week, we remove the penitential elements of many of our services. So, like, for example, we don't do Psalm 50, even though it's called for in a number of places. It would be skipped entirely during Bright Week because it's considered too penitential. Also, although this practice also varies, but it is a Slavic practice, and it's one that I have seen in a number of parishes, that nothing is ever sort of like plain chanted during Pascha or Bright Week, and it's all sung. So, like, even the hours that we would usually read, you'll hear the choir singing Paschal hours as we get into liturgy.
Does it maybe not do prostrations that whole time?
Yes. Once we get into Pascha, we don't do prostrations anymore. Yep.
Even like up until Pentecost?
Yeah. Although, I will say, there is variation there. I've heard at least one or two hierarchs indicate that it is their preference for people to generally continue doing prostrations because many people don't do very many prostrations in general, and it's a good spiritual practice. And so I've heard some that will recommend to continue whatever you're normally doing and just pause for Bright Week only. But if you look at the services, we usually would not be doing prostrations until Pentecost. Yeah. But
Is there like a way to know, we have like a fasting calendar and everything, like, how do we know on certain days if we should or shouldn't prostrate? Because I know sometimes I go in and then just like, depending on who we're commemorating, sometimes I'm like, okay, maybe I feel like I shouldn't today, but then like nobody knows.
Sundays and feasts of the Lord, you do not do prostrations. So that's why Pascha would be included in that, right? Because it's the feast of the Lord. But if, for example, Nativity can fall on any random day of the week, right? Because it's not associated with a weekend after Pascha. It's associated with December 25th. So if Nativity falls on a Tuesday, even though normally on Tuesdays you would do prostrations, you would not on that service because it's for Nativity. If you're doing a vigil for the Feast of St. John, who we just had 2 days ago, St. John Chrysostom, even if you're doing a full vigil, it would still be called for to do prostrations. In parish practice, prostrations during services are wildly hit or miss. Many people simply don't know when to do them because it is not a practice that we do on Sundays, and therefore they just don't know. And so most parishes that you go to probably will not, you'll probably, except for the pre-sanctified services in Lent, you will probably not see any prostrations done. Some parishes in this particular diocese of the OCA will do prostrations on Sundays. One single one at the epiclesis, more or less, as I'm remembering right, anyway, in liturgy. And the reason for that being, yes, generally speaking, we don't, but people just don't ever. And this is the only time they go to church. It should be that the norm is weekday services and the exception is Sunday services. But for most people, the norm is Sunday and there is no exception. So then adding those prostrations there would be the only time you'd ever really do prostrations ever. If you were to do that at a parish outside of this diocese, people would probably look at you funny and may even tell you not to do that. But does anyone else know? What is the epiclesis? I've mentioned it a few times. We've talked about it. Epiclesis, what is that? It's a fancy Greek word.
Oh, is that the descension, descending of the Holy Spirit onto the bread and wine?
Well, Mike has the answer for when that actually happens, because he's said it a few times now, I believe, in some of our classes. When does the Holy Spirit descend on the gifts? Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. But yes, that
Saint Basil
does not have it.
doesn't say what.
Yeah. But that line in St. John's liturgy, making the change by the Holy Spirit, is called the epiclesis.
It's also the name of my frog rock metal band. Sorry.
So what was week 1 and 2 then before Triumph of Orthodoxy and then the feast day of St. Gregory Palamas, second triumph, let's call it that, because I always mess up the name. But so, because obviously those are later than when Pascha actually happened, so what was there before?
Sorry, what do you mean?
Because on we're talking about the different weeks, there's a different kind of like celebration, like Triumph of Orthodoxy, St. Gregory, the cross and so forth. So
Mm-hmm.
what was there before those, especially the second one, because that's 14th century.
I see what you're asking. Yes. Did I put it in here? No, I don't think so. There is a second theme for all of them in the Lenten Charity, and you'll see it referenced a few times. I'd have to go check again, but there is a second list of themes for each week. It might even be, yeah, I can't remember now. But it has mostly been replaced with the themes that are here, other than a few spots, as I recall. I could be wrong. There could be it could be a little more prevalent than I'm thinking. There's a lot of hymnography in the Lenten Charitian, so it's entirely possible that in one of the services we don't do, it's a little more prevalent or something like that. But at least as I recall, these themes have vastly replaced everything else that was before them. Yeah. Could go ask an old believer.
I have a question for the second week of Lent.
Yes.
With St. Gregory Palamas.
Mm-hmm.
Is it, so I was under the impression it was celebrating his defense of hesychasm, or is that different? Or is it the same and I just misunderstood what you were saying?
I just didn't use that word.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The ascetical practice in prayer.
Okay, all right, yeah, there we go, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
I have said this before, and I will continue to stand by that I don't like using technical Greek terms because they are largely meaningless outside of our little sphere and bubble, and then you just have to constantly redefine these words when we could just use English words and not have to define anything for anyone. So if you are writing a thesis for something, then by all means, use the correct Greek terminology for all of these things, but I'd rather just be a little more clear in my communication and not rely on foreign words that no one's ever heard of.
So it was really that big a deal, though, that he sort of defended these ascetical practices.
Yeah. Trying to pull the specifics out of this, but yes, so if you look at that last line, allowing the Holy Spirit to work in us so we can become like God, I think that was really the crutch of what he was kind of fighting against at the time, was this idea that we are just doing this to make ourselves worthy so that God can eventually kind of look on us, a theme you may have found elsewhere in the Christian world. But that what his whole thing was to say that no, everything we do is by the grace of the Holy Spirit. So the ascetical practice, the prayer, the Eucharist, whatever, all of this is so that God can work through us. None of this happens without God's assistance and grace, and without that we can do nothing, right? So
at the time, it really was a huge controversy, enough that it
Trying to be good enough compared to
that's what I'm remembering. I think another thing that I'm remembering here is the salvation through our bodies. So again, I think there was kind of this hints of what I just said leading to, well, we just need to do away with our body altogether, right? And focus on these ascetical practices because our bodies don't matter. And his point was to say, no, our body is important. It's what God works through. It is what conveys grace, just like everything else can, just like the relics that we, venerate, and the icons, as stated the week before in the Triumph of Orthodoxy, right? That this is an important part of who we are and an important part of how we interact with God and how he works through us.
What would have been previous to St. Gregory, what would have been celebrated during that second? Was there a feast day that was celebrated before he defended Orthodoxy and all this?
Yes, so that was a question he was asking before. I can't remember off the top of my head the list. I thought I had it in here, but I don't seem to. So I don't know if I just got rid of it at some point or what exactly, but there is a second set of themes for each of these weeks that are much older than these current ones, which is part of why, for example, there is a feast for St. Mary of Egypt, and then we celebrate her again, right? Because one of them is older and was done over here, and the other one was over there, and at some point they kind of reconciled, and so we got kind of 2 times for St. Mary, the singular day where we read her entire life, and we've got the full canon of St. Andrew on top of it. It's a very long service, as you may recall. And then also the entire last week there as well. So, though I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was a second list of themes that would have been for every week.
Is there potential for a regional practice to arise, say, in the U.S. That at some point potentially would then get practiced during a certain week?
Probably not. So the way that we see that sometimes happen is usually because of groups that maintained that practice. So one good example of this is, interestingly, churches that came in through the Unia, the Byzantine Catholic churches. They were Orthodox a long time ago, as evidenced by their services looking nearly identical to ours, but then they were forcefully encouraged to become Catholic. And so they started commemorating the Pope. They came to the U.S. Bishop John Ireland was extremely hostile towards them, and so huge numbers of Byzantine Catholic churches ended up coming back into the OCA. So most of the old OCA churches on the East Coast are actually formerly Byzantine Catholic churches that came into Orthodoxy. They have some practices that they maintained when they were under Rome that predate other things. They're not Roman. There were times when various popes tried to encourage them to Latinize. So some of the things they do are very much clearly Latin-influenced things that were added later. But some of the things they do predate pretty much every other practice extant right now that they just held on to, they continue to do through the Roman thing, and then they come here and have continued to do. Another place that you see that sometimes is in the various old believer communities. They can be a little insular, and they don't tend to like to mix with other people very much, so it doesn't practically influence the rest of the church at all. Their anathemas have been lifted, so they could come back into communion if they chose, and some have, but only, I believe, one in the U.S. That's in Erie, Pennsylvania. All of the other old believer communities here in the U.S. are separate. They do maintain very old practices, but I can't imagine them becoming mainstream. The only time really that we see a difference in practice is when it is adopted from another group here. So, for example, the difference in entrances or the processions at Pascha, right? That is currently the way things are done in Byzantine churches, Antiochian or Greek or whatever. And it's been done here because a big group of people came here and were sad that it wasn't done that way. And it's within the realm of Orthodoxy, so okay, sure. But yeah, we really don't tend to do the revival thing. And another good example of that is we know there's a number of things that we know historically were done, but we really don't have any record of how. So for example, like a baptismal liturgy is something that there's plenty of evidence to say that was common in some places anyway. But we don't have anything today that tells us how it was done. There is no group that maintained that to this day. And so though you may, actually, most of you I think know, I won't name the person, but you know of at least one person that was brought into the church that way. It has been done here. Our bishops came up pretty strongly a few years ago saying, stop. We don't have any records. You are just making things up. Yes, we know it happened, but we don't know how. And so what you're doing is not that, probably. So don't do that. Do the things that we know how to do because we've received that tradition, not something you're just making up. So, and just to really hammer that home, what would we be replacing the hymns with, right? There's the Lenten Triodian, it's somewhere over here. It's a pretty thick book. There's a lot in there. So sure, you could go through and replace it all, but that's a lot. So.
There's even in something like Lent, there's this flexibility over time. It seems that there was, not a clearly things have changed, and so
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true in a lot of ways. We mentioned earlier about the liturgical color variations in the different fasts, right? So the core of the faith obviously isn't changing, but the colors we don when celebrating can certainly, or some of the additional themes that we're remembering as we lead up to this other thing, sure. Yeah. Questions about it? Yeah.
Just curiosity, with fasting in Lent, do we maintain the fast up until the day of Pascha?
Up until when?
Up until the day of Pascha.
Yes. Is your question because Lazarus Saturday and Palm Sunday and Holy Week are not technically part of Lent?
Yeah.
Yes. They are considered strict fast days, despite not being part of Lent. Yeah. Some places will even, although it's very much a monastic practice, will encourage various amounts of not eating at all during that period. For example, from at least noon to 3 on Friday when Jesus hung on the cross, it is normal to not really eat anything at all. And on Holy Saturday, the next day, it's pretty normal to only eat a small amount of food after liturgy, and then to have nothing else for the rest of the day, because of course then we're turning around and starting the fast for the midnight communion for Pascha. So, yeah. Sorry, you don't get to have a big fancy hamburger on Lazarus Saturday before Pascha. Yeah. I point that out because it is technically not Lent. In practice, I don't know that it really is a distinction that matters much, but technically speaking, it's not Lent. And we do change colors, right? It's the only weekend before Pascha, but still part of the Lenten period, generally speaking, that we would not wear purple, right? Because we were green for Palm Sunday. So there is some difference there. Palm Sunday is also one of the only fish days outside of Annunciation, if Annunciation falls in Lent, which it doesn't always, on the old calendar anyway. There are a lot of moving pieces. So I don't want to get too off into the weeds of the way all these things can work, but anything else? Questions about the fast that we are starting? I'll prompt you then. What are you going to do on Thanksgiving?
Eat with family?
Yeah.
You usually get the blessing from the bishop, right?
I mean, I don't think, yeah, the bishops have given their blessing to have a meal with your family.
Don't be weird.
Yeah. If you're going to have something at home by yourself, I guess if you wanted to treat it like a fish day or something, sure, fine. Nativity fast already is a lot less strict than Lent, so there are a lot more fish days. So if you are all by yourself and no one else will invite you over, then I suppose you could treat it as a fish day, but
I feel like the bigger problem is you can get invited.
yeah.
Maybe you're just a super introvert.
Although I will also specify that for that it is only the one meal. It's not a free pass for a whole day or anything, yeah. You can take some home, you've all got freezers, so.
Freezer burn.
It's not that long. It's only a few weeks, it's fine.
Freezer wedding cake and eat it.
Yeah. Well,
It's funny, I always tell a lot of Orthodox people to eat the leftovers too. They're like, well, you eat on Thanksgiving and then you're gonna have leftovers, so eat on the next day. That was something I was told a lot coming in.
freezers. They work very well.
I can tell this is not something new to you, that you've done this yourself.
Yeah.
It's not jar in your freezer.
That's true, yeah. Although if you're going over to someone else's house, it doesn't matter, you won't have leftovers, right, so.
Just eat really slowly.
I'm getting hungry.
Well, if that's everything, we can certainly be done. A little early, but not too bad. All right. Well then, I will see you all next week. God willing, anyway. Thank you.
You gonna want to rent this?
No,